It feels like every time you check the news lately, there's another headline about the simmering tensions around China and Taiwan. It's definitely top of mind for military leaders and, well, all the really sharp minds in international security.
It really is, yeah.
And that's exactly where we're plunging in today. We're not just going to skim the surface. This is a full-on deep dive.
Absolutely. This isn't some, abstract geopolitical theory anymore. The sheer volume of analysis and strategic thought being poured into this potential conflict is, frankly, it's staggering.
Mm-hmm.
And as we'll unpack, there's very good reason for that intense focus.
Right. So for this session, you handed me a veritable mountain of reading material. We're talking everything from detailed military assessments and the outcomes of some pretty intense wargaming exercises.
Yeah, some heavy stuff in there.
To in-depth geopolitical analyses and even a look at the fundamental economic forces at play. Our sources include the CSIS report, First Battle, Next War, Stephen Roach's compelling work on accidental conflict, a Carnegie Endowment study projecting U.S.-China relations out to 2030.
Right. Looking ahead.
The Pentagon's latest annual report on China's military developments, a RAND report exploring the potential for protracted conflicts, and Kevin Rudd's insightful book, The Avoidable War. It's a real buffet of perspectives and hard data.
What's so illuminating about bringing all these different analyses together is how the various pieces start to fit. You realize this isn't just a question of, who has more tanks or planes.
Right.
It's a deeply complex interplay of military might, sure, but also powerfully shaped by political narratives, underlying economic realities, and even the weight of historical baggage. It all connects.
Okay, so our mission today, which we have enthusiastically accepted, is to wade through all this information and extract the really crucial insights about a potential war over Taiwan.
Sounds bad.
We want to get a handle on how it might actually kick off, what the fighting could look like on the ground, in the air, and at sea, and what some of the most likely outcomes could be.
Yeah, the potential scenarios.
We're doing this for you, our listener, so you can get a truly well-informed and nuanced understanding of this critical issue without feeling like you're decoding classified documents.
Right. Make it accessible.
And while nobody wants this conflict, and the hope is that it can be averted, the sheer potential for widespread devastation means a serious and informed public discussion is absolutely vital.
Couldn't agree more.
And just to be crystal clear, our aim here is to present the analysis as it exists in these sources, not to debate the merits or costs of defending Taiwan. That's a whole other can of worms for another day.
Precisely. Our goal is clarity to illuminate a very high-stakes situation so that you, the listener, can grasp its complexities.
So, let's set the stage. While the headline-grabbing scenario is often a full-scale military invasion, some of our sources highlight that China has other levers it could pull against Taiwan. What are some of these alternative strategies they might consider?
That's a really important point to start with. The CSIS report, for example, makes it clear that a direct invasion isn't the only card China could play. They might opt for strategies like diplomatic isolation, essentially trying to squeeze Taiwan out of the international community, limiting its recognition and participation in global forums.
Right, make them feel alone.
Exactly. We could also see a significant increase in what's termed gray zone pressure, and to put it simply, that's actions that are coercive and potentially destabilizing, but fall just short of outright military attack.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, think things like more frequent and aggressive military exercises in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. That's an area of airspace over international waters that a country monitors for potential threats.
Got it, like buzzing them constantly.
Kind of, or stepped up cyber intrusions, targeting critical infrastructure or other forms of coercion. And then, of course, there's the economic angle, leveraging China's massive economic power to exert pressure on Taiwan.
Right, kind of a death by 1,000 paper cuts approach, or maybe a slow simmer instead of a sudden boil.
That's a good way to put it.
But it's true that a significant portion of these documents, particularly the military assessments, seem to focus on the invasion scenario. Why is that?
The primary reason is the sheer magnitude of its potential consequences. While those other strategies, the diplomatic isolation, the gray zone tactics, the economic coercion, could certainly inflict significant damage over time. A full-scale invasion represents the most immediate and existential threat to Taiwan. It also carries the highest risk of triggering a direct military response from the United States and potentially other allies in the region.
So it's the biggest, most dangerous flashpoint.
Exactly. So naturally, military analysts tend to focus on this most challenging and potentially decisive scenario.
And speaking of analysis, the term wargaming comes up quite a bit, especially in the CSIS report. For anyone who hasn't encountered this before in this context, can you give us the super simple ELI 5 version of what wargaming is and why it's such a crucial tool here?
Okay, think of it like this. Imagine a really intricate board game. But instead of just a few pieces, you have entire armies, navies, and air forces.
Okay. Massive scale.
Right. And instead of simple rules, you have complex computer models that simulate things like how effective different weapons might be, how quickly troops can move, and the challenges of supplying those forces. Logistics, attrition, all that.
So computers crunching the numbers.
Yeah, but crucially, the players in this game aren't just moving pieces randomly. They're experienced military officers and civilian analysts who act as commanders, making strategic decisions based on the simulated situation.
Ah, so human strategy meets computer simulation.
Precisely. And these games aren't played just once. They're run again and again with different starting conditions and assumptions. What if the U.S. responds within 24 hours? What if Japan decides to join the fight immediately?
Exploring the variables.
Exactly. This allows analysts to explore a wide range of possible outcomes and really understand which factors have the biggest impact on how the conflict might play out. So it's not about predicting the future with certainty.
Right, not a crystal ball.
But more about stress testing different scenarios and identifying key vulnerabilities and potential turning points, really understanding the dynamics.
Okay, so it's less about having a crystal ball and more about rigorously exploring the what-ifs to understand the dynamics at play. The CSIS report specifically mentions that their project provides an unclassified analysis of these invasion outcomes, which they say fills a real gap in the existing literature. What exactly was that gap, and why is having an unclassified analysis so important?
Well, the gap was precisely in that publicly available detailed analysis of how a Chinese invasion of Taiwan might actually unfold from a military operational perspective.
So the nuts and bolts of the fighting.
Exactly. While there's been plenty of discussion about the political ramifications and the broader strategic implications, there hasn't been a lot of unclassified, in-depth work looking at the nitty-gritty of a potential military campaign. Things like where they might land, how they might try to establish air superiority, the logistical hurdles, all that stuff.
And why unclassified? Why is that key?
This unclassified analysis is significant because it allows for a more informed public conversation. As the report itself argues, any productive policy debate needs to be grounded in some shared understanding of the potential realities on the ground.
Makes sense. Can't debate policy without knowing what might actually happen.
Right. If we don't have a common baseline of what might happen militarily, it's really difficult to have a meaningful discussion about what the appropriate response should be. The report highlights a fundamental disagreement among experts right off the bat.
What's that?
Could China potentially seize Taiwan very quickly? Maybe even within a day or two, presenting the world with a fait accompli. It's over before anyone can really react.
A lightning strike.
Or could Taiwan's defenses hold out for a more extended period, perhaps weeks, giving the U.S. and its partners crucial time to mobilize and deploy?
A longer, drawn-out fight.
Exactly. And the answer to that question dramatically shifts the entire strategic and policy landscape. Huge difference.
Absolutely. And what did this extensive wargaming tend to reveal about, where China might initially try to land its forces if they were to launch an invasion? The report mentioned the south of Taiwan as a likely target. What's the thinking behind that?
Across the vast majority of their wargame simulations, I think it was something like 21 out of 24 scenarios. According to the report, the games indicated that Chinese forces would most likely attempt to land on the southern coast of Taiwan.
Okay, why the south?
The primary rationale behind this is that the Taiwanese defenses are generally perceived to be lighter in that region compared to other parts of the island. It's seen as a potentially easier way for the invading force to get boots on the ground and establish an initial foothold.
So, path of least resistance, initially.
Pretty much. However, and here's where it gets really interesting, while securing a beachhead in the south might be less heavily contested initially, the terrain further north as you move towards Taipei, the capital city, becomes significantly more challenging for an advancing army.
Ah, so the geography changes.
Big time. It's characterized by mountainous regions, and the coastal plains are quite narrow, with natural obstacles like rivers and urban centers that could offer strong defensive positions for the Taiwanese military.
So a southern landing might be easier to start,
Right. Quicker initial success in terms of getting ashore.
but then a much tougher slog north.
Could be. It might lead to a much more protracted and difficult fight to achieve the ultimate objective of capturing the entire island. The report even points out a fascinating historical parallel.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 1944, when U.S. military planners briefly considered the possibility of invading Taiwan, which was then under Japanese control,
Right.
they also identified the southern part of the island as a potentially advantageous landing zone.
Wow. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes, huh?
Something like that, yeah. It's a striking echo.
That is fascinating. Now let's talk about what the opening moves of a conflict might look like. If an invasion were to occur, what kind of military actions might we anticipate seeing right out of the gate? The first few hours, days.
The wargaming scenarios consistently suggest a high probability of China initiating hostilities with a massive barrage of missile strikes. Just overwhelming firepower.
Aimed at what specifically?
Primarily aimed at neutralizing Taiwan's air power on the ground, preventing their aircraft from getting airborne and contesting Chinese air superiority.
Take out the planes before they can fly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And crucially, they would also likely target U.S. air bases in Japan in an attempt to limit the rapid buildup of U.S. tactical air capabilities in the region, which would be critical to Taiwan's defense.
So, hitting U.S. assets right away. That's a huge escalation.
It absolutely is. And in these early phases, the war games generally indicated that China would likely achieve at least temporary air superiority over Taiwan.
Okay, so missiles fly, air power is targeted. What else?
Simultaneously with the missile strikes, we'd probably see China deploying naval surface action groups. These are essentially formations of their larger warships like cruisers, destroyers, and frigates to the east of Taiwan.
To the east. Why there?
Their primary role there would be to provide air and missile defense for the invading fleet, essentially creating a protective screen for the amphibious ships bringing troops.
Got it. A shield for the landing force.
Right. And further out into the Western Pacific, they would likely deploy their submarine force to try and deter U.S. surface fleets, particularly aircraft carrier strike groups, from getting too close to Taiwan.
Okay, so a multi-layered approach right from the start. Missiles to cripple air power, a naval screen to the east to protect the invasion force, and submarines lurking further out to keep the U.S. at bay.
That's the picture painted by the simulations, yes. A strategy aimed at rapidly establishing local military dominance and trying to isolate the battlefield in those crucial early hours.
But the report also hinted at a potential vulnerability for those Chinese surface combatants deployed to the east. What's the trade-off there?
Exactly. While those surface action groups provide a valuable defensive umbrella for the vulnerable amphibious fleet carrying the invasion troops, positioning them further to the east also makes them more susceptible to attack themselves.
How so?
They are, by definition, further away from the protective umbrella of the Chinese mainland's air defenses and shore-based anti-ship missile batteries. They're kind of out there on their own.
So they're exposed.
More exposed, yes. So it's a calculated risk they're prioritizing, slowing down the rate at which the relatively slow and exposed amphibious landing ships might be sunk by U.S. or Taiwanese forces, but in doing so, they are increasing the vulnerability of their own surface warships to potential counterattacks.
A classic military dilemma. Balancing offense and defense, accepting risk here to gain advantage there.
Precisely. It's all about trade-offs.
Let's shift our focus now to the potential response from the United States and its allies. The question of whether and how the U.S. would intervene seems absolutely central to any analysis of this scenario. Is there a general consensus among analysts, based on these sources, about the likelihood or the nature of a U.S. response?
Not at all. No, the CSIS report specifically points out that there is a significant spectrum of opinion among mainstream analysts, as well as within what's often referred to as the restraint camp.
The restraint camp.
Yeah.
Meaning those who advise against intervention.
Correct. These individuals and groups argue against direct U.S. military intervention in a conflict over Taiwan. Their arguments often center on the potentially catastrophic costs and risks of such a conflict for the United States, including the possibility of escalation to a nuclear exchange, the immense economic disruption, and the potential for a prolonged and inconclusive war. Really high stakes.
And how does these wargaming exercises factor in different potential U.S. responses? Do they explore scenarios where the U.S. might be slower to react, perhaps due to competing global crises, or even choose to withhold a direct military response initially?
Yes, absolutely. The CSIS report explicitly details what they term pessimistic scenarios in their wargames.
Pessimistic for Taiwan, I assume.
Yes, from Taiwan's perspective. These are simulations where the U.S. response is either significantly delayed, perhaps due to other major global crises unfolding simultaneously, like a conflict erupting in Europe, pulling focus and resources.
Right, stretch thin.
Or where the U.S. chooses to withhold a full-scale military intervention, at least in the initial stages. Unsurprisingly, these more pessimistic scenarios tend to lead to much more negative outcomes in the wargames, with a higher probability of China achieving its objectives.
So U.S. timing and commitment are absolutely key variables.
Clearly identified as absolutely critical variables in determining the potential outcome of a conflict. Hugely important.
Another pivotal player in this potential conflict is Japan. Given its geographic proximity and its close security alliance with the United States, what's the assumed role of Japan in these war games? And do the analysts explore different possibilities regarding Japanese involvement?
The base case assumption in the majority of the wargaming scenarios analyzed in the CSIS report is that Japan would indeed enter the war if Japanese territory, specifically U.S. or Japanese military bases located in Japan, were to come under direct attack by China.
Okay, so an attack on bases in Japan triggers their involvement.
That's the baseline assumption, yes. It makes a lot of sense given the very strong security alliance between the U.S. and Japan and the significant presence of U.S. military assets stationed on Japanese soil.
Makes sense. But do they explore other options?
Yes, the report also highlights excursion scenarios, variations on the main simulations that explore other possibilities. For instance, what if Japan decided to join the U.S. in the defense of Taiwan right from day one of a Chinese invasion, even without a direct attack on Japanese territory?
A proactive intervention.
Right. Conversely, they also explored scenarios where Japan chose to remain neutral and never formally entered the conflict.
Staying out of it entirely.
Exactly. These variations allow the analysts to really drill down and understand the significant impact that Japan's involvement, or lack thereof, could have on the overall trajectory and potential outcome of a Taiwan conflict. Japan's role is seen as potentially decisive.
And what kind of losses did the war games project for all sides? Involve the U.S., Taiwan, and even China, even in those scenarios where China ultimately fails to achieve its operational objectives. The report mentions some pretty staggering potential figures.
The losses projected in the wargaming base scenarios were, frankly, horrifyingly high for all participants. Just brutal.
How high are we talking?
Even in the scenarios where China does not successfully occupy Taiwan, meaning they fail to achieve their primary military goals, the United States still suffers air combat losses that could potentially exceed those experienced during the entire Vietnam War.
Wow. More than Vietnam.
Potentially. Naval losses for the U.S. could be greater than anything they've seen since the Second World War.
Since WWII. That's incredible.
Japan, due to its proximity and the likelihood of its bases being targeted, also faces heavy losses, with its airfields often being struck and significant damage inflicted.
And Taiwan itself.
And, tragically, Taiwan would bear the brunt of the conflict on its own territory, suffering immense personnel losses, both military and civilian, and catastrophic damage to its infrastructure. Just devastating.
It sounds absolutely calamitous. What about China's losses?
What's particularly sobering is that China's losses are also projected to be enormous. They would likely lose vast numbers of aircraft, a significant portion of their naval fleet, particularly the amphibious landing ships so crucial for an invasion.
The invasion fleet itself.
Right, and potentially hundreds of thousands of personnel. The report does note that the typical base scenario often concludes relatively quickly, frequently with the sinking of much of China's amphibious fleet within the first 10 days or so.
10 days. That's a remarkably short time frame for what sounds like such a massive and intense conflict.
It really underscores the incredibly high stakes and the potential for rapid, devastating losses right from the outset. This initial phase would be incredibly violent.
The report also touched on how variations in U.S. military strategy within the war games impacted the projected U.S. air losses. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Different approaches, different costs?
Certainly. The wargames reveal a significant range in potential U.S. air combat losses, depending on the specific strategy that the U.S. forces employed in the simulation.
Oh, yes.
Some of the wargaming teams opted for a strategy of rapid reinforcement, attempting to surge a large number of U.S. aircraft into the theater as quickly as possible and basing them at airfields relatively close to Taiwan.
Get in fast and close.
Right. While this approach aimed to quickly establish air superiority and support Taiwanese ground forces, it often resulted in very high U.S. air losses early in the conflict as these forward-based aircraft became prime targets for Chinese missile strikes.
So, faster response, higher risk early on.
Exactly. Other wargaming teams adopted a more cautious approach, perhaps staging U.S. air assets further back outside the immediate range of China's initial missile barrages.
A more standoff approach.
Kind of. This more deliberate approach tended to result in lower overall U.S. air losses, but it also potentially meant a slower buildup of air power in the critical early days of the conflict, which could have negative consequences for Taiwan's ability to defend itself.
A trade-off between force protection and immediate impact.
Precisely. Interestingly, the Wargames consistently showed that Japanese losses tended to be higher in those more pessimistic scenarios, where China specifically targeted air bases in Japan, highlighting Japan's vulnerability if it were to become a primary target of Chinese attacks.
Let's pivot now and take a closer look at China's own military capabilities and some of the inherent challenges they might face in a potential Taiwan scenario, as outlined in these various sources, particularly the Pentagon's annual report on the PLA. What are some of their key areas of focus in terms of military development?
The Pentagon report really underscores that the People's Liberation Army's, PLA, overarching strategic objective is to develop a robust set of capabilities that can effectively deter or, if necessary, defeat any potential third-party intervention in the Indo-Pacific region.
And third-party basically means the U.S. and its allies.
It's quite clear that primarily refers to the United States and its network of allies in the region, yes. They are also focused on projecting Chinese power and influence further into the broader Indo-Pacific.
And how are they trying to achieve that? What are they building?
To achieve these goals, the PLA is heavily prioritizing the modernization and expansion of its naval and air forces, recognizing that these are the key branches for both power projection and for countering potential external intervention in a Taiwan scenario.
So ships and planes.
Big focus there. The report details significant advancements in PLA air and naval systems, noting that they are now capable of operating at greater distances from the Chinese mainland and sustaining those operations for longer durations. More reach, more endurance.
What about different branches working together? Joint operations.
There's also a very strong emphasis on developing and improving joint operational capabilities, the ability of different branches of the military to work seamlessly together in a coordinated fashion. That's critical for something complex like an amphibious invasion.
But are they there yet?
The report does point out that their ability to conduct complex joint operations beyond what they refer to as the first island chain.
Like this.
Basically a series of island chains stretching from Japan through Taiwan and down to the Philippines. Their ability to operate jointly beyond that chain is still somewhat limited and continues to be a key area of development, still a work in progress further out.
And what about the PLA's approach to what's often called information warfare? And what's their overall vision for how future conflicts might be fought? Cyber, AI, that sort of thing.
The PLA places an extremely high value on achieving what they call information superiority in the early stages of any conflict. They see it as fundamental.
Information superiority, meaning?
The Pentagon report highlights that they view information operations, which encompass things like cyber warfare, electronic warfare, and psychological operations, as absolutely critical for achieving this dominance. They aim to disrupt an adversary's command and control systems, degrade their intelligence capabilities, and influence their decision-making right from the outset.
Get inside their heads and mess with their systems.
Essentially, yes. The report specifically notes China's significant and persistent cyber espionage and attack capabilities, which pose a continuous and evolving threat to the military and critical infrastructure of potential adversaries, including the United States.
And looking ahead, what's their vision?
Looking towards the future of warfare, the PLA is aggressively pursuing what they term intelligentized warfare.
Intelligentized warfare. Sounds advanced.
It is. This is their vision for future conflict that is characterized by the pervasive integration of artificial intelligence across all aspects of military operations, from intelligence gathering and analysis to autonomous weapon systems and battlefield management.
AI everywhere on the battlefield.
That seems to be the goal. It's a concept that's still evolving, but it signals the PLA's belief that AI will be a decisive factor in future wars.
Intelligentized warfare. It definitely sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie. But the Pentagon report also makes it clear that despite all this rapid modernization and these ambitious goals, the PLA still faces a number of inherent weaknesses and deficiencies. What are some of the key challenges and limitations they're grappling with?
That's right. Despite their impressive progress in modernizing their armed forces, the PLA itself acknowledges several significant shortcomings. For instance, their special operations forces, while growing in capability, still lack extensive real-world combat experience, which is often considered invaluable in high-stakes operations.
Book smarts versus street smarts, militarily speaking.
Kind of, yeah. There are also persistent challenges related to decentralized command and control, which is somewhat humorously captured in their internal 5 incapable slogan.
5 incapables, what are they?
It's apparently a critique of officers who struggle with maintaining adequate situational awareness, fully understanding the intent of higher command, making timely and effective decisions in dynamic situations, efficiently deploying their troops, and effectively handling unexpected circumstances on the battlefield.
So, basic command challenges, but maybe amplified in a complex, modern force.
Could be. The PLA also recognizes limitations in conducting sophisticated urban warfare operations and in managing the complex logistical challenges associated with long-distance power projection.
Both of which seem pretty relevant for Taiwan.
Extremely relevant, yes, especially the logistics of a massive amphibious operation. However, it's important to note that the PLA is actively working to address these identified weaknesses through the implementation of new and more rigorous training systems, and by conducting increasingly complex exercises. They know where the gaps are.
It's fascinating to see that even with all the technological advancements and the focus on modernization, fundamental aspects like real-world combat experience and the complexities of logistics remain significant hurdles. The Pentagon report also goes into some detail about specific PLA exercises that appear to be directly related to a potential Taiwan scenario, like Joint Sword. What can we glean from watching these exercises?
These exercises offer really valuable glimpses into how the PLA might actually attempt to conduct a military operation against Taiwan. The Joint Sword exercise, for example, involved multiple branches of the PLA, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force operating in a coordinated manner.
Testing that joint capability.
Exactly. And it appeared to simulate various critical aspects of a potential invasion scenario, including amphibious landings, air superiority operations, and missile strikes. The report specifically highlights the use of advanced systems like the PCH-191 long-range multiple rocket launcher during these exercises.
What's that do?
It underscores its likely role in providing joint fire support during a Taiwan campaign, basically. Long-range artillery coordinated across branches.
So these exercises are like dress rehearsals?
In a way. The increasing frequency, scale, and complexity of these types of PLA exercises in the vicinity of Taiwan strongly suggest a continuous effort to refine their operational concepts, improve inter-service coordination, and rehearse the various phases of a potential invasion scenario.
Doesn't guarantee success, but shows they're practicing hard.
Precisely. While these exercises don't guarantee success in a real-world conflict, they certainly provide valuable data points for analysts trying to understand China's military thinking and potential courses of action.
Let's delve a bit deeper into the specific branches. The Pentagon report highlights the PLA Navy, or plan, and its development into what they term a global force. What are some of the most significant recent developments in their naval capabilities?
The PLA Navy is indeed undergoing a significant transformation and is rapidly developing into a more capable and far-reaching global force. They are building a substantial number of increasingly modern and larger warships, including a growing fleet of aircraft carriers.
The carriers get a lot of attention. How significant are they?
They're particularly significant as they extend the plan's air defense coverage far beyond the range of their land-based aircraft and allow them to project power and influence over much greater distances, essential for blue water operations.
What else are they focusing on at sea?
There's also a very clear and growing focus on developing sea-based land attack capabilities, which would provide the plan with more options for projecting power ashore and striking targets deep inland. Missiles launched from ships.
And logistics, keeping those ships fueled and supplied.
Critically, yes. They are also investing heavily in building up their fleet of logistical replenishment ships, which are absolutely essential for sustaining naval deployments far from their home ports. Can't project power if you can't sustain it.
And are we seeing them operate further out more often?
Yes, the Pentagon report notes the increasing frequency and geographic range of planned deployments. This includes more frequent and longer duration operations by their aircraft carriers in the Philippine Sea, as well as increased amphibious warfare training exercises in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific.
They're practicing further afield.
And they're doing more joint exercises, too. We've seen a rise in joint naval exercises conducted with other nations, most notably Russia, in both the Pacific and even the Arctic regions, further demonstrating their expanding operational reach and ambitions.
The report also details the ongoing development of the PLA Air Force, or PLAAF, particularly in the realm of long-range strike capabilities. What kind of advancements are we seeing there? Bombers and missiles.
The PLAAF is actively working to enhance its ability to conduct long-range strike missions. This includes the continued development and deployment of aircraft like the H-6N bomber.
What's special about that one?
It's believed to be potentially capable of carrying nuclear-capable air-launched ballistic missiles, significantly extending China's strategic reach. Launching ballistic missiles from a plane.
And there's a new stealth bomber coming too.
They are also in the late stages of developing a new stealth strategic bomber, the H-20, which is widely expected to also have a nuclear delivery mission. These developments underscore the PLAAF's ambition to transform into a truly strategic air force.
Meaning global reach.
Capable of projecting air power at considerable distances to protect China's growing global interests and to deter potential adversaries. Interestingly, the Pentagon report also notes an organizational shift. The PLA recently transferred a significant number of its land-based combat aircraft from the PLA Navy to the PLA Air Force.
Why would they do that?
It likely reflects a strategic decision to allow the plan to focus more specifically on the development and operation of its rapidly expanding fleet of carrier-based aviation assets. Letting the Navy focus on ships, the Air Force on land-based planes. Makes sense.
What about the other elements of China's extensive security apparatus, like the People's Armed Police, PAP, and the China Coast Guard, CCG? What roles might they play?
The People's Armed Police is a large paramilitary force that is primarily responsible for maintaining internal security within China, kind of like a National Guard, but huge.
And the Coast Guard reports to them now.
Yes, the China Coast Guard is now formally under the command of the PAP, and the CCG has become an increasingly assertive actor in disputed maritime areas, particularly in the South and East China Seas.
The gray zone stuff we talked about earlier.
Often acting as China's frontline force in asserting its sovereignty claims in a way that falls short of direct military confrontation, using white-hulled ships instead of gray ones.
Could they be involved in a Taiwan scenario?
While their primary mission isn't offensive military operations in the traditional sense, the CCG could potentially be utilized to establish maritime blockades around Taiwan, to control access to key sea lanes, and to provide various forms of support to PLA naval operations.
And the BAP itself?
The PP's Special Operations Forces could also potentially play a role in maintaining internal security within Taiwan itself in the event of a successful invasion and occupation. Post-invasion control.
The Pentagon report also touches on China's rapidly expanding space-based capabilities and their increasingly sophisticated cyber operations.
Yeah.
How do these critical domains factor in?
Space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR satellites, are becoming absolutely crucial for China, providing them with global situational awareness for both military and civilian purposes. Eyes in the sky.
And communications.
They also operate a network of communication satellites, some specifically designated for military use, which would be vital for maintaining command and control over their forces in a distant conflict, keeping everyone connected.
And they're developing ways to attack other countries' satellites.
Recognizing the critical importance of space in modern warfare, China is also actively developing a range of counter-space weapons designed to degrade or even completely deny an adversary's ability to utilize its space-based assets, taking out the enemy's eyes and ears.
And cyber. We mentioned it earlier, but how central is it?
In the cyber domain, as we discussed, the PLA views cyber operations as a fundamental pillar of achieving information dominance. Their aim is to launch disruptive and potentially destructive cyber attacks against an adversary's critical infrastructure, power grids, communication networks, financial systems.
Civilian targets, too.
Potentially, yes, as well as against their military networks right from the very outset of hostilities. The recent Volt Typhoon activity.
What was that?
It targeted critical infrastructure in the United States, and it's often cited as a potential example of the kind of pre-positioning and preparation that China might be undertaking in the cyber realm, laying the groundwork.
Finally, on the purely military front, let's briefly touch upon the developments in China's nuclear forces, as highlighted in the Pentagon report. What are the key trends? More. Better.
China is engaged in a significant modernization and expansion of its nuclear arsenal across all domains, land, sea, and air. They possess road-mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, like the DF-31 and the more advanced DF-41.
Road mobile makes them harder to find, right?
Exactly. Significantly enhances the survivability of their land-based nuclear deterrent. They are also fielding increasingly capable sea-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, such as the JL-3, on their Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs.
The subs with nukes.
Right. And the report indicates that they are increasing the frequency of near-continuous at-sea deterrence patrols with these submarines, providing a more credible and survivable second strike capability, always having some hidden at sea.
And new subs coming too.
Furthermore, they are actively developing a next-generation nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, the Type 096, which is expected to carry even more advanced SLBMs with a greater number of warheads.
So, across the board, a bigger, more modern, more survivable nuclear force.
These comprehensive developments suggest a growing emphasis on ensuring the survivability and the overall effectiveness of their nuclear deterrent, which undoubtedly plays a significant role in their strategic calculations regarding potential conflicts in the region. It's the ultimate backstop.
Shifting gears somewhat, let's turn our attention to that RAND report you mentioned, the one focusing on the possibility of protracted conflicts with China, conflicts that could last much longer and be far more unpredictable than traditional planning scenarios usually assume. What's the core message there?
The central message of the RAND report is that any significant military conflict with China would almost certainly be incredibly costly human lives, economic, strategic, and it would carry a very significant and ever-present risk of escalation, including nuclear escalation. We know that.
Okay, but what's the specific angle on protracted conflict?
Beyond those risks, the report specifically emphasizes that future conflicts with China might not be the short, decisive affairs that some traditional military planning might assume. They delve into a variety of potential scenarios, exploring how a conflict could become protracted, lasting for extended periods, potentially years, and taking unexpected and unconventional forms.
Not just a quick fight over Taiwan, then. It could drag on.
Exactly, and morph into something quite different.
The report even presents some rather unconventional and frankly quite surprising examples. Can you tell us a little more about one of those? The lost in space scenario sounded particularly out there.
Yes, the lost in space scenario is definitely a departure from the typical war games we might envision. It posits a future conflict that actually originates not on Earth, but in the increasingly contested domain of space, specifically in cislunar orbit.
Cislunar. Between the Earth and the Moon.
That's the region, yes. The scenario begins with an accidental collision between a Chinese and a U.S. satellite operating in this region.
An accident turns into a fight.
Instead of being seen as an isolated incident, it escalates as both sides interpret it as a hostile act and begin retaliating by attacking each other's valuable satellite assets in cislunar space, tit-for-tat satellite killing.
But it stays in space, near the Moon.
What makes this scenario so unique and highlights the potential for protracted conflict in unexpected domains is that, in this particular instance, neither side chooses to escalate the conflict to other orbital regimes closer to Earth or to targets on Earth itself.
So, a war confined to deep space.
Instead, they remain engaged in this ongoing space war in the vicinity of the Moon, continuously launching new, more heavily defended satellites to replace those that have been destroyed. A constant battle, but far away.
That's bizarre. Would people on Earth even know?
The really striking aspect of this scenario is that the conflict could potentially rage on for an extended period with minimal direct impact on the economies, the politics, or even the daily lives of most people back on Earth who might be completely unaware that a significant military conflict is even taking place.
Wow. A secret space war. It's a really creative, unsettling example of how conflict could manifest in completely unexpected ways.
And remain confined to a specific domain, potentially for a long time.
That's a truly wild scenario. The RAND report also briefly mentioned another potential scenario involving a civil war in Russia. How might that factor into a protracted conflict with China? Seems unrelated.
The Russia Civil War scenario is included to illustrate how unforeseen global events could significantly complicate the strategic landscape and potentially contribute to a protracted conflict with China, even if the initial trigger is elsewhere.
How so?
In this hypothetical, a civil war erupts in Russia, and alarmingly, weapons of mass destruction are used internally. This creates an extremely chaotic and dangerous intelligence environment globally,
Total confusion.
making it extraordinarily difficult for other nations, including the US and China, to accurately assess what's happening. Crucially, this kind of chaos in a major nuclear power would also directly impact any foreign military personnel in the broader region.
And pull focus away from, say, Taiwan.
It could potentially draw in or distract other major global powers, including both the United States and China, diverting their attention and resources. It could lead to unforeseen alliances, shifts in power dynamics,
And generally create a much more unpredictable, unstable world where conflicts could drag on or connect in weird ways.
Exactly. A major destabilizing event like that could easily influence the dynamics and duration of any separate conflict involving China. Everything becomes interconnected and potentially prolonged.
Let's now turn to Kevin Rudd's book, The Avoidable War. He delves deeply into the layers of distrust and what he calls the false narratives, fueling tensions between the U.S. and China. What's his central argument about these underlying tensions?
Rudd's central argument is that the current perilous state of the U.S.-China relationship isn't just about recent events. It's the culmination of a long, intricate history marked by cooperation, yes, but also deep-seated suspicion and fundamentally different worldviews.
And these false narratives.
He contends that over time, both countries have developed deeply ingrained false narratives about the other's simplified, often negative portrayals that are increasingly detached from complex reality.
And these narratives are dangerous.
Yes, actively contributing to a dangerous cycle of mistrust and escalating the risk of conflict, particularly over Taiwan. For example, he argues that in Washington, there's been a significant erosion of belief in China's long-professed peaceful rise narrative.
You just don't buy it anymore.
There's a growing perception within the U.S. establishment that the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, is inherently deceptive, increasingly assertive, even aggressive. This is fueled by China's actions in the South China Sea, its naval expansion, overseas bases, cyber activities.
So U.S. sees China as untrustworthy and expansionist.
That's a key part of the narrative Rudd describes.
And Rudd emphasizes this is mutual. China has its own false narratives about the U.S.
Absolutely. He meticulously traces the history, highlighting how initial optimism or even alliance during the Cold War gradually gave way to deeper animosity. He points to moments like the Korean War.
Direct conflict.
Right. Direct conflict, heavy American casualties, concerns about POW treatment. It led to a surge in anti-China sentiment in the U.S. This period also saw the development of U.S. security alliances across East Asia, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Australia.
A containment strategy.
Explicitly aimed at containing China. Then the relationship really hit bottom in the 1960s. Intense ideological conflict, mutual suspicion.
And those old feelings linger.
Rudd argues these earlier periods of deep antagonism left lasting negative memories and ingrained perceptions on both sides, which continue to color how each nation views the other today. Historical baggage.
That also discusses the fundamental ideological divide, U.S. liberal capitalism versus Chinese Marxism-Leninism. How big a factor is this?
Rudd argues this fundamental ideological divide is indeed a core, long-standing point of contention. It significantly shapes the relationship and fuels these negative perceptions.
How so?
He contends that the CCP views the United States as representing a fundamentally different and, in their view, ultimately hostile worldview based on liberal capitalism, democracy, a U.S.-shaped global order.
Which clashes with China's vision.
Directly clashes with the CCP's own ideology and its vision for a different international system, one more multipolar, less U.S.-dominated. This deep ideological difference colors how each interprets the other's motives, intentions, actions, often leading to suspicion and assuming the worst.
He also delves into the interplay of ideology, nationalism, and economic prosperity as sources of legitimacy for the CCP. How has that balance shifted?
Historically, the CCP gained legitimacy first by opposing Western exploitation. Then, after Mao's economic failures, Deng Xiaoping brought in reforms, embraced market approaches, engaged globally to boost growth and living standards. That was huge.
But that faith in the Western model faded.
It began to wane somewhat after the 2008 global financial crisis, and then again during China's own financial instability around 2015. Under Xi Jinping, there's been a noticeable shift back towards more state control.
More party control.
Renewed emphasis on party leadership. Pursuit of common prosperity, maybe at the expense of some private sector dynamism. Rudd raises a key question. Can this model sustain the high growth that's been crucial for CCP legitimacy?
So the internal balance in China affects its external relations.
He argues that balancing ideology, nationalism, and economic delivery has always been a delicate challenge for the CCP, and it remains so today, with potential ramifications for their relationship with the U.S.
Rudd also outlines China's core strategic aims, especially in this maritime backyard. What's China trying to achieve there, and how does the U.S. fit in?
Rudd argues China sees its maritime periphery as complex and, to some extent, hostile, filled with U.S. alliances.
A ring of containment from their perspective.
Possibly. He posits China's primary goal is to secure this periphery, asserting claims in the East and South China Seas, and ultimately achieving reunification with Taiwan, ideally on its terms.
And longer term, beyond the immediate neighborhood.
Rudd contends China's long-term ambition is to gradually displace the U.S. as the dominant military power in the Asia-Pacific, creating a new regional order where China is paramount.
How do they plan to do that without a fight?
He suggests China's strategy involves building such formidable military capability and projecting such resolve that it creates enough doubt in U.S. minds about winning a regional conflict, especially over Taiwan, that the U.S. would ultimately choose not to intervene militarily.
Win without fighting, by making the cost too high for the U.S.
In essence, Rudd believes China hopes to achieve its goals through the perception of its growing power and the potential costs of U.S. intervention rather than actual force.
Rudd also takes aim at some U.S. economic narratives about China forced tech transfer, blame for the trade deficit. What's his counterargument? Drawing on Roach's work, too.
Rudd, leaning heavily on Stephen Roach's analysis in Accidental Conflict, argues the persistent U.S. trade deficit is mainly due to a shortfall in U.S. domestic saving versus investment, not primarily China's fault.
So blaming China is a false narrative.
He argues it's a significant oversimplification of a complex macroeconomic issue rooted more in U.S. domestic factors. Similarly, on forced tech transfer.
A big complaint in the U.S.
Rudd acknowledges IP theft is a real concern. However, he contends the narrative of systematic, widespread, forced tech transfer by the Chinese government doesn't really hold up to scrutiny.
So how does tech transfer happen then?
He emphasizes a lot occurs through legitimate commercial deals, joint ventures, licensing between private companies, normal business, often overlooked in the more accusatory narrative of China as a relentless tech predator.
Rudd also discusses China's industrial policies like Made in China 2025 and its push for AI leadership. Why are these potential flashpoints?
According to Rudd, these ambitious policies are seen by many in the U.S. as a direct challenge to America's long-held tech dominance and future economic competitiveness.
A threat to U.S. leadership.
Made in China 2025, aiming for self-sufficiency and global leadership in high-tech sectors, is seen by some in the U.S. as deliberately undermining American industry. Similarly, China's intense focus and investment in AI, aiming for a first-mover advantage,
also seen as a threat.
Viewed with considerable concern in the U.S. The perception grows that these aren't just legitimate development goals, but direct threats to U.S. tech leadership, economy, even national security. This fuels anxiety, competition, and potential conflict in these vital areas.
Rudd also highlights how information distortion, amplified by AI, is worsening things in both countries. How does this work?
Rudd argues that growing information distortion, extensive censorship and propaganda in China, plus misinformation, disinformation spread via social media in both countries is significantly worsening the relationship.
Making trust impossible.
In China, censorship erodes trust and transparency. In both countries, AI-enabled manipulation amplifies divisive, false narratives, entrenching biases, creating a polarized, less informed public discourse.
It's harder to understand the other side accurately.
Increasingly difficult for policymakers and the public to get a clear picture of the other's true intentions, goals, capabilities. This breeds suspicion, miscalculation, and elevates the risk of unintended escalation. Bad information leads to bad decisions.
Rudd references Henry Kissinger's warning of a potential new Cold War, possibly worse than the first, and notes the U.S. lacks the economic leverage it had back then. Unpack that for us.
Kissinger's stark comparison underscores the potential for a devastating, protracted conflict if things continue spiraling down into intensified great power competition.
And why might it be worse? The economic ties.
Rudd emphasizes that unlike the Cold War with the Soviets, where the U.S. had significant economic superiority and the economies were largely separate, today the U.S. and Chinese economies are deeply intertwined. Global supply chains, trade, investment, very connected.
Which makes a clean break or containment much harder.
Much more difficult, costly, and potentially damaging to the U.S. itself. Economic interdependence means conflict in one area could quickly spill over, with far-reaching global consequences.
And less U.S. leverage.
The lack of clear U.S. economic leverage comparable to the First Cold War means old strategies might not work as well in managing the challenges posed by a rising, deeply integrated China.
Finally, Rudd offers some thoughts on managed strategic competition as a potential framework. What does that look like?
Rudd argues that given the deep distrust and intensifying competition, the U.S. and China urgently need a framework to manage the relationship and prevent accidental escalation or outright conflict.
So managed competition means?
His concept involves establishing clearly defined, mutually understood hard limits or red lines in security and military policy areas where miscalculation could be catastrophic.
Boundaries you don't cross.
Right. Within those boundaries, though, they could still actively compete in other areas: diplomacy, economics, technology, ideology.
But it also needs cooperation.
Crucially, yes. The framework needs dedicated space and mechanisms for practical cooperation on shared global challenges that transcend borders, climate change, pandemics, financial stability, nuclear non-proliferation, things you can only solve together.
Sounds difficult to achieve.
He acknowledges it would be incredibly difficult and complex, requiring sustained political will, clear communication, willingness to compromise, seeing the other's perspective sometimes.
But the alternative is worse.
He argues the alternatives, unchecked, hostile competition with constant risk of miscalculation and conflict, are far more dangerous and ultimately unsustainable. This managed approach might offer China an acceptable way forward while protecting its core interests and reduce risks for the U.S.
It's become abundantly clear throughout this deep dive that understanding the potential for conflict involving China and Taiwan is incredibly complex. It's this deep tangle of history, economics, ideology, and a whole lot of mutual suspicion and distrust.
Absolutely. As the wargaming and the expert analyses from across these diverse sources consistently demonstrate, there are indeed plausible and very concerning scenarios for how a conflict in the Taiwan Strait could potentially unfold.
And the costs.
The projected costs are frankly staggering for all potential participants. However, it's absolutely crucial for us, as listeners and informed citizens, to remember that these are just potential future trajectories based on current data and expert assessments.
The future isn't set in stone.
Not at all. The critical decisions made by leaders in both Washington and Beijing in the coming years, even months, will ultimately be the primary determinants of what actually transpires in this incredibly sensitive and strategically vital region. Choices matter.
So here's a final and perhaps somewhat unsettling thought for you to really chew on after our discussion today. Given the very real potential for massive human and economic costs and the genuine risk of a protracted, destabilizing conflict touching everyone, what fundamental, maybe even uncomfortable shifts in strategic thinking might be absolutely necessary for both the United States and China to navigate their relationship and avoid the most dangerous outcomes?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
What are the long-term implications of these dynamics that you, our listener, think we really need to be considering?
Yeah, that is indeed the critical question we all need to be grappling with. It requires a willingness to move beyond the current cycle of suspicion and accusation, maybe, and to actively seek out new ways to truly understand each other's perspectives.
Find common ground.
Find common ground where possible, and above all, to develop effective mechanisms for managing our fundamental disagreements before they ever reach the point of military confrontation and unintended escalation into something, well, truly catastrophic.
Well, that brings us to the end of our very in-depth deep dive into this incredibly important and complex issue. Thank you so much for joining us today as we tried to unpack some of the most critical aspects.
My pleasure. Lots to think about.
If you found this discussion insightful, thought-provoking, or even just a little bit terrifying, we would absolutely love it if you can take a moment to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for more in-depth explorations of critical global challenges.
Please do.
We are always really keen to hear what you, our listeners, are thinking, so please do share your thoughts, any follow-up questions that this discussion might have sparked, or any other topics you'd like us to delve into in future episodes in the comments below.
Yeah, let us know what's on your mind.
Your engagement really helps us shape what we do next, so please let us know what else you're curious about. Until next time, keep thinking deeply.